Therapists of Reddit. What was the moment you realized your client couldn't be helped? Please like and subscribe to support this channel. I worked at a non-profit domestic violence counseling center back in the day. It wasn't that they couldn't be helped, it was just that eventually you learned it was rare they would change. Some clients would do all the work, attend all the group sessions, make so much progress and say they're ready to change. As a therapist, you trust them, believe them and hope they don't come back. But they do. The cycle continues. Their kids get put in the system. Abuser keeps abusing. Time for me to dust off my _annual semi-annual reply to these AskReddit threads. Therapist here. I don't share stories about my clients except in specific circumstances, e.g. we need to report an imminent suicide threat, coordinate care with a physician, etc. To me, sharing client stories to entertain strangers on the internet isn't professionally ethical. It isn't worth the risk to the client. Can you imagine if you went to see a therapist, and then recognized your own story in this thread? Or something close enough to your own story that it makes you wonder if it could be yours? How would it feel to believe that your therapist thought you were their quintessential example of a client who could not be helped? And if your therapist is willing to post on Reddit about it, who else might they be telling? What if you were a person dealing with trauma who is wary of mental health professionals? Would reading this thread make you want to trust therapists more? TLDR. I'm not going to share my client stories. I don't think you should either. If you are still considering posting client stories, please first review the APA ethics code if you're a psychologist, or whatever ethical guidelines are relevant to your profession. This happened with my brother. My mom signed him up for much needed therapy, and he went for about a month or so before coming home very angry one day and saying he was never going back. My mom talked to the therapist, and she couldn't really tell any details for confidentiality reasons, but the gist basically seemed to be that she spent the month listening to him and trying to get him to think about things on a deeper level, and when she finally started outlining things from an outside perspective that didn't align with his, he got very angry with her. He quite literally couldn't handle the truth. I'm not a therapist, but I have volunteered in a mental health cafe with qualified counselors. We often, volunteers included, had training from the NHS on suicide and self-harm, and we would have meetings with people high up in the mental health field for better insight on how we could assist these people. The mental health cafe in part was made to actually give people a place to turn to in crisis without needing to be sent to a mental health hospital. If the ambulance service got a call for a mental health crisis, they would take the patient to us instead of A+E. I was volunteering there because I myself was extremely unwell mentally, and thought it could help me. What I learned in those meetings with the experts I'll never forget. Most patients they speak to can't be saved, and they weren't expecting us to believe we could either. We needed to abandon that thought, otherwise it was crush us. Keeping a patient alive isn't perceived as saving them. Most of the time we just encourage them away from suicide because they are a ticking time bomb for mental health. If they die, their family inherits the pain and trauma instead. An hour of conversation every few days away from their family wasn't going to help them. It was just a metaphorical way of giving them oxygen. Only the patient could ultimately save themselves, and oftentimes they were too far beneath the water to reach anyone. I stopped volunteering there shortly after that. They were so CQ-sually talking about my situation without realizing it. My mental health has improved greatly since, but it's definitely declining again. This thread has made me realize I need to reach out to people again. I never want to go back to that headspace. I am not the therapist here but rather the patient. I was in university at the time and using the school therapists there. I had a few different ones because they were part of the PhD program, and once they completed their PhD they left to go work out in the real world. I finally found one that I really connected with and began opening up more than I had to any of my therapists in the past. She let me finish talking and then said, "I'm sorry, but I am not qualified to handle cases such as these. In fact, none of the therapists here are. I'm going to refer you to an excellent therapist outside of school, but I can no longer offer you treatment. There are apparently certain topics that only licensed professionals are able to handle." I didn't know that, otherwise I would have kept my mouth shut. Never did end up getting the treatment I was hoping for. Tried a few therapists since then but just didn't really have a good connection with them. I really miss her. I hope she finished her PhD program and is out there changing lives somewhere. I could likely still benefit from therapy, but I have grown very good at just handling my own problems. I'm a nurse, not a therapist. But it's a general thing in healthcare where, you can't help someone if they won't help themselves. Mental health disorders aren't like infections where you can just plug them with antibiotics for a few days and they're cured. The people actually have to work hard to get better. And some people just don't want to do that. You can make all the suggestions, say all the right things, talk to them about absolutely everything that's gone in their life. But if they don't take your suggestions and actually do something with them, then there's just no way you can help them. They have to make the decision to be helped. They have to decide to get better. You're just there to guide and encourage them along their journey. I worked inpatient psych and had someone come on suicidal on a 72-hour hold. He was very intelligent with a PhD in physics or something. He mentioned he'd do whatever we need and was very polite and sweet. Next day we are chatting and he freaking runs and dives off a filing cabinet. We extended his hold, if I recall, a few days or whatever the law allowed. On his way home he jumped out of the vehicle and dove off a bridge onto a rock. Whole time we had him I assumed he would do the deed after discharge. Not a therapist, but rather a client, and I ended up giving a therapist an existential crisis once. He had to drop me after that. It was pretty out of the blue, and he made it very clear and apparent to me that at some point during our sessions, something was triggered in him that unleashed a whole load of his own trauma. It began to bleed through what you would expect of the typical boundaries a therapist would have between clients, and he mentioned that even after our sessions, he couldn't get it out of his head. He politely advised me that he wouldn't be able to see me anymore because he had to seek a therapist himself before he could start seeing clients again. Fortunately, I was able to continue seeing a different therapist that he recommended to me and I'm doing fine now, but I still joke about the time I won therapy. Psychologist here. There is one former client in particular, who I was working with in a state prison. We were talking about their pending exit from prison, they were maxing out, i.e. no parole, and talking about how they planned to mitigate their mental health care in the community. The client proceeds to say, I plan on drinking, fucking, and snorting as much as I want. Said they had no intentions on staying clean and had just snorted a shit ton on Kool-Aid because they couldn't find anything else to snort. I told my supervisor at the time then that I could not help this person. They were engaged in other unsavory actions and made clear they had zero intentions of changing anything. This client has since passed away. There are other stories I could go on about, but this one is the one that immediately comes to mind. After quite literally catching my alcoholic client drinking vodka from the bottle at 9:30 a.m., he refused to acknowledge he actually drank from the bottle. Then proceeded to claim it was water. When I then asked for a glass, he claimed it was not his bottle. Never so much as got past his denial phase despite dozens of interventions, UCs and blatant red-handed catches like these. A year later, he has developed Korsakoff. He will likely die from liver failure before this year is over. Try this on for size. 22Y, homeless indigenous male with schizophrenia, polysubstance addictions, and extensive history of trauma. F6 sub 70 and previous traumatic brain injuries. Parents dead from overdose. And apparently too crazy for a secure PSYC admission. There are thousands of people in this situation. Be it black, white, indigenous or whatever. As community addiction and mental health workers, we help as much as we can until they inevitably overdose or kill themselves. That's the mental health system in Canada. Not a therapist, but a person who often spread themselves too thin by trying to help a friend with their problems. Had a friend years ago who had a lot of issues at home and it was all she ever talked about to me. She was in foster care, her mum always guilted her about things, her mum ended up ill. Things about her dad's GF. How she hated her foster parents for X, Y and A reasons, and I would always listen and offer suggestions. The next day she'd vent to me about the exact same issues as the days prior and I'd continue to comfort her and to help her find solutions. This continued for about a year, and if I had any issues and told her, she would listen and then instantly start talking about her own and how they were worse. Eventually it got to the point where I couldn't take it. She hated her situation but did nothing to change it. It was as if she got off on being miserable and I could feel it wearing me down. She was nice otherwise, and I did truly feel bad for her, but we don't talk anymore. My mental health was slipping. My so's mother is a textbook narcissist and has brainwashed every therapist into thinking that they're perfect and that she only needs to be in therapy to deal with the unnecessary and unwarranted stress that her children, family at large cause. Hershey's created a very intimate relationship with her current therapist, like almost romantic. They text each other every day and at the end of the day, they exchange this phrase, Good night, my heartmate. This therapist was reputable but is now wrapped around my so's mother's finger and believes that she can do no wrong. This level of narcissism is something I never knew I'd witness, let alone be involved with to some degree. They will never be able to get help at this rate. Some of these responses I doubt are coming from therapists, so I will try to answer as clearly as I can. The first answer is, if they clearly don't want to help themselves. Therapists can guide you, provide a useful and objective outside perspective, help you reframe your experiences, and can provide tools to help you direct your energy and thoughts. But we cannot do anything for you. We cannot start or end relationships for you. We cannot make you take your medication, or force you to cease any of your destructive habits or practice new beneficial habits. Those are your decisions, and I cannot make any of them for you, even when to me the consequences of those decisions are clear. The second answer is, when I am not the right therapist for this client. There are many reasons why I may not be the right therapist. I have my own style of communication, my own values, and my own personality, and those may not work with a certain client. I have had little success with certain clients who I have sent to other therapists and they have done well. Similarly, I have taken on clients who were frustrated with their past therapists and I have worked well with them. The last answer is, when the client's pathology requires intense or medical intervention. Therapy cannot substitute for inpatient care when that is needed, and therapists cannot prescribe medication even when that would help. Unfortunately, inpatient care is always in short supply and many clients resist that idea, and you often have to advise them that they cannot see you until they complete an inpatient course of treatment. I have to be very clear here. The dramatic statement, "A therapist said I was too messed up to be helped," is often what clients hear, frequently because it advances their specific narrative, when we will always try to help, even if it means asking them to see another therapist or pursue another course of treatment. The analogy I use is that most mechanics can work on most cars. But if you have an unusual foreign car, you'll probably get better results finding a mechanic with more experience working on that brand. "I cannot help you" is not the same as, "you cannot be helped." Quote, "A family member was dropped by their therapist because of constant lying. Basically, this family member, who is an incredibly toxic individual, played the victim to her therapist and then encouraged them to speak to her adult children, assuming that the therapist would take her side and tell the children how horrible they have been. Needless to say, the therapist got the truth from the children and sent a letter stating that they could no longer meet with the family member, going so far as to encourage them to seek inpatient treatment." Adding on to the posts from the patient side, I had a therapist tell me in the first session that my trauma was too much for her to work on, and would need a specialized hospital, if it could be helped at all. I appreciate that she said she didn't have the specific skills before we wasted time. But I could have done without the ominous, "if anyone can help at all." Or it might already be too late, talk. A few years ago, my, now ex-wife and I started marriage counseling and individual therapy at the same time. About 6 months later, the clinic stopped all 3 sessions within a week of each other. The marriage counselor said that we were not reaching our goals, so there was no point of continuing. My therapist basically commented that I was fine after getting on meds for depression. Oh boy, was she wrong. My ex-wife claims to have concluded on her own that she was fine, although she told me that her therapist recommended that she continue. My guess is the owner of the clinic basically figured out that my marriage was a complete train wreck and she wanted nothing to do with either of us. My therapist turned me into my superiors, after already being separated from the military, just waiting for my retirement date to kick in, for smoking marijuana and telling her it was one of the best experiences I've had. She told me in the beginning that the only thing she would report is self-harm or violence against other. I learned that day not to trust my therapist, and I don't talk about my drug use, when at raves mostly, to my current therapist because of it. Not the therapist in the situation, but I was a member of the care team. A teenage client had a lot of antisocial behaviors. They were escalating. He checked pretty much all the boxes for an antisocial diagnosis, but they were still officially calling it conduct disorder at the time. After one weekend, he was bragging to his psychiatrist about his new hobby of breaking into elderly people's homes in the night. The best part was how funny it was when they were afraid of him. Sometimes they even cry. The kid had a total disregard for literally everyone and everything. The psychiatrist made a comment after that session that the best case scenario is the kid ends up in a psychiatric prison before he is able to develop more violent hobbies. He was an excellent manipulator, so he could tell anyone exactly what they needed to hear to, successfully, work through any required therapy. I'm not a therapist, but I'm a qualified counselor who worked with traumatized young people in a residential home. Essentially, my team and I were surrogate parents for these kids, each spending between 1 and 3, sometimes 5, nights a week at the house. Before the case that broke me, I had experienced a lot of different behaviors. Sexualized behaviors, violent outbursts, reactive attachment. I'd worked with kids who'd burnt down houses, solicited themselves, used intravenous drugs, killed family pets, attempted to kill siblings, etc. I thought I'd seen enough to become callous to it all. I was at work with 2 young people I absolutely adored. They called me uncle, a term of respect and endearment in Indigenous Australians. When I got a call at 9:30 p.m. at night asking me to relieve a shift the next morning with an intense case, I accepted because before this kid I thought I was Superman and could handle anything. I arrived at 6 a.m. and got a handover and a heads up from the workers on shift. They warned me this kid was violent, but as far as I knew it wasn't anything I hadn't seen before. There's an expression, eyes are the window to the soul. When you looked into the eyes of this child, there was a darkness unlike anything I'd seen before or likely will see again. It was obvious that the evils this child had endured had destroyed their soul. This child attempted to proposition me for sexual favors as soon as we were alone. When I tried to redirect the conversation to appropriate methods of expressing gratitude, this child shifted. They took a pencil out from under the desk and charged full pelt, screaming, "You're a fucking pedophile rapist. You're just like the rest of them. Don't fucking touch me," etc. This child proceeded to stab me multiple times before the other worker was able to subdue them. This same child was on a very unique child safety order. The terms of the order were a direct contradiction of the legislation and had to be signed by the state manager. This child was to be kept on site unless medically necessary due to the danger to themselves and the community. Once the escalation settled and the nighttime routine begun, the child asked me for more soap. This had to be given in small containers at a time to avoid the child creating slip traps for workers. As I approached with the soap, the child had peeled the mirror off the bathroom wall and smashed it over my head before lunging at me with a shard. I managed to catch their wrist and disarm them while my coworker secured the debris. The child then swallowed a piece of glass and smirked at my coworker and I, knowing we'd have to take them to the hospital. Once at the hospital, the child ran away before even entering triage. This is where it gets interesting. In her safety plan there were 25 possible addresses the child frequented. A common behavior of the child was to exchange sexual favors for meth, so the houses we had to search for her at were filled with less than desirable folks. I received a call from the police to say they'd located her at a nearby service station. Upon arriving, the child had doused themselves with fuel and threatened to light herself and the whole place on fire. She ran away again but wasn't seen or heard from for the rest of the night. That was my first shift with a child that had put 42 other workers on work cover. I worked with them for another 8 weeks before throwing in the towel. I had a mental breakdown and began drinking heavily for the first time in 10 years. I had begun taking prescription medication for the pain. This kid broke 2 teeth and threw my back out, and for the mental anguish. I was never the same happy-go-lucky optimist again. Knowing the best solution for a child is a quick and painless death was not easy for my psyche to handle. The longer I worked with the child, the more I learned about them. They were born into a pedophile ring. Their mother was the product of rape and had been molested since childhood and simply continued the cycle. That was 5 years ago, and since I've had to leave the industry, I no longer drink, but I am filled with pessimism. I refuse to have children because of that child. The fact that some kids can't be saved scares me out of risking having my own. I still have nightmares about this kid. I don't know if any of this makes any sense. Please let me know if any parts are confusing. Not a therapist. I had read a comment by a therapist on a similar question in #X200B. Patient A was being diagnosed by the therapist. It was very suicidal and was prescribed to be hospitalized. Later on one day, the patient sharing room with a committed suicide and A was suggested to change hospital. Later on, therapist Op realized how aware A was of all the facts and was acting to be disturbed. After some background check, therapist found out that A used to befriend his roommate, pal at the mental hospital, convince them to commit suicide with them, let them do it first and not do it himself, and the cycle would continue at the new hospital. I was a therapist for the British Army for a while, and I don't think I ever had a patient who was flat out beyond help. There were a couple that were beyond my help and I had to refer on to specialists, but that's not uncommon in that kind of job. Not every therapist is equipped to deliver every kind of therapy. It's more about being able to recognize when your methods aren't benefiting the patient and a different approach would be more effective for them. There isn't really such a thing in the practice of therapy as someone being a lost cause. Not a therapist, but I cleaned house bi-weekly for an absolutely wonderful woman for a few years. She was actually one of my professors in college for a couple literature classes, and during that time she was going through a pretty severe battle with depression. She was seeing a therapist on a regular basis, but one day when I came over she said her therapist had let her go. When I asked why, she said she was told it was because she smelled like mold, and it was disrupting her therapist's respiratory system, which they claimed took them at least a day to bounce back from. Needless to say, she sank a bit deeper into her depression and it took a few months before she had the gumption to try and meet another therapist. Not once did I ever catch even a whiff of something nasty, mold or otherwise, not on her or in her house or in her car. I am a pretty detailed cleaner too. I take covers off of air vents and stick the vacuum hose down there, pull out drawers and clean all the crumbs out of the corners. It was hard not to take a tiny bit of offense myself, and it's not even my house. It so obviously deeply upset her and made it much more difficult for her to battle with her depression, not to mention how much more vulnerable she must have felt seeking further help elsewhere. I still want to rage punch her old therapist just thinking about it, and it's been close to 4 years. 1 month in with this couple, a wife had just spent 5 minutes explaining the impact of her husband's language on her, and how devalued, disregarded, and unimportant she felt in the relationship. His response to her was to, verbatim, use the exact language she had just described to respond to her. She collapsed into sobs, and he sat back, sighed, rolled his eyes, and gestured vaguely to her, as if I would agree that she's the problem. I told him exactly the opposite. He stormed out. She went to the lawyer I recommended and cleaned him out. Full custody too. It was truly a happy ending. Emotional abuse is still abuse, folks. And #X200B. And #X200B. Edit to add my response to another comment here. Greater than when people endorse abuse in an intake session, we do not proceed. If they endorse abuse later, we do not proceed. If I have my suspicions but there isn't an endorsement, or any concrete evidence, I take the opportunity to build enough evidence to label it, and build rapport with the victim to eventually educate them, and provide them with the resources they need to exit safely if they want *** to leave. Greater than the struggle with emotional and/or psychological abuse, as opposed to physical abuse, is that victims of emotional abuse are far more often in denial. They often cannot label the behaviors accurately, because after months or years of being gaslit, they no longer trust their recollection. Because no one is being hit, a client must understand what emotional abuse is to identify it as abuse. That doesn't always happen, especially when we take into consideration the impact of culture and socioeconomic status on a person's social expectations. What is intolerable to some as status quo for others as therapists, we live in the in-between. Greater than furthermore, many people that present with emotionally abusive behaviors are often functioning in fight, flight, freeze as the result of their own trauma. The vast majority of intermittently abusive arsawads can and do change with the appropriate support and boundaries during session. I've seen it, I've lived it, and it's beautiful. When the attempt to educate and set boundaries fails horribly, we do not proceed. Which is exactly what happened here. Greater than the client storming out and leaving only beat me to it. Another session would not have been scheduled regardless. Greater than the point is, it's easy to say therapy never works for abusive relationships, but how this boundary is actually executed, and when it's drawn, is an entirely different story. I had a therapist send me a very kindly worded letter that told me she couldn't see me anymore until I found a way to remember appointments and show up. 3 months later I called and said I found a way to remember and I wanted to try again. She took me back and I never missed another appointment. Doing that was crucial. I needed to make therapy a priority for it to help. If I hired a personal trainer but never showed up or never did any exercise, then even the best personal trainer could not help me. A therapist is a personal trainer for the mind. They can't actually fix or do any of the work. They can only suggest work or help their client choose work to do. The client can't be passive. They must do work. I was let go by a therapist. I was being treated for depression by my university psychologist. In actuality, I was bipolar and yet to be diagnosed. I was coping in every possible unhealthy way. Self-harm, alcohol, binging, purging, etc. The university wasn't set up for long-term care, so after a certain number of sessions she had referred me to an outside psychiatrist, but it was a terrible experience and I went back to her. She told me that she couldn't keep seeing me for her own mental health. She had become so concerned for me that it was affecting her. It was incredibly hard to hear. Like, I'm so fucked up I even disturb a professional. But mental health professionals are people too, and I understand why. I am a therapist for sex offenders. One particular client was a drug user, but thus far it did not seem to interfere with the therapy. It was in no way related to his criminal acts, until one day he showed up for his appointment completely high on hard drugs. He had already been awake for 48+ hours. Turned out his drug abuse was way worse than he'd make it seem. He also severely damaged his penis while high, he told us. We immediately referred him to a rehab and never heard from him since. My sister was let go by her therapist because she was lying to him constantly. He told my dad the therapy was a waste of money as long as she wasn't prepared to face her issues. It's been about 20 years since then and she is still a train wreck. I consequently started seeing him a few years later for depression and he was wonderful. I didn't want medication, so he didn't recommend starting any, and the CBT was really what I needed to get out of the thought cycle I was in. Once we both felt like I was in a good place and had developed the tools I needed, he let me go. Great guy that really helped me. Client was just coming to sessions because they had a crush and, in their words, thought they could make me fall in love with them. This happens very often, and has made me consider leaving the profession. Another client had no desire to stop using, or even try harm reduction. Their drug misuse was getting in the way of any progress. One client was motivated when in session, but would go back to toxic group of peers who would essentially undo everything. Client didn't want to reduce how much they were seeing said peer group, nor remove them from their life. These clients only represent about a quarter of my roster, thankfully. They had an advanced extreme case of antisocial personality disorder, too agitated, too aggressive, with substance abuse. After months in therapy at a hospital, there was no progress whatsoever and nothing to be done. Their family didn't want them, neither did the police, nor the hospital, and after setting their bed on fire and harming the other patients, I was just too scared to work with them, so I closed the file and spoke to the doctor to find another solution. Sadly, COVID happened and they had to lay off a huge majority of the staff in the hospital. Since I was still new, I was let go. I still don't know what happened with the patient. I work in a high school. Couldn't make this up if I tried. It's one of our contract, peer support, counselor last week before she moves on to a new job and came up to me shaking a few hours ago, and I was like, "What's up?" She said the student she has been working with for the last 2 months, who's basically a train wreck, just got a new boyfriend and they already sleep together, but was happy, and when she showed her a pic of him, it was the counselor's 19-year-old brother. She was like, WTF? What do I do? I can't break confidentiality, but it's my brother and it's kind of breaking the law, plus she said the two of them together are a bad combo. Just a WTF moment. I swear, this could easily be turned into a horror movie. Young lady wants to help troubled youth. Kid gets attached. Adult gets offered new job. Kid flips out, goes psycho and stalks her. Starts dating younger brother just to attend family's functions. Just to be near her. Where she confesses her love and tries to kill her. I had a therapist tell me I was better and dropped me when I was going through one of the worst moments in my life after seeing her for 5 years. She was the director of a psychiatric ward at a local hospital and did therapy as a side gig to feel like she was making a direct impact. She would constantly interrupt me and tell me that she couldn't relate due to her happy childhood. She would get frustrated when one session on a topic wouldn't fix lifelong trauma. She even went so far as to say that she wouldn't touch some of my issues because I clearly wasn't going to get better, even though those issues were nowhere near as serious as some other things we covered. Looking back, she clearly was doing therapy as a way to make herself feel better, and not seeing immediate results was frustrating her because it wasn't this fun, feel-good side gig that she wanted. 2 months after being dropped, I had a serious panic attack and ended up finding another therapist who was a much better fit. I've made more improvement in the past 6 months with this therapist than the entire time with my previous therapist, and I'm so much happier now. It goes to show that therapists really need to be the right fit. The best they can hope for is to live out their days as a ward of the state in a facility where they can be regularly medicated and kept away from society. This girl is smart, very smart, but also she doesn't understand consequences in the least. And one little thing you might say to her like, "We can't get a drink of water from the fountain. Let's go in here, I will get you a bottle of water," is a justifiable cause in her mind for her to gouge your eyes out with a cafeteria spork and strangle you until you die. Family member of mine would either be pulled out or let go by her therapist. This happened every single time, no matter who she saw. They all had the same reason, until she's ready to start telling the truth and acknowledge that she isn't what she's telling everyone. We won't be able to help her. She lies constantly, and I honestly, truly believe she has a superiority complex. Doesn't matter what it is, she's done it better. I'm a qualified animal trainer, behaviorist, carer, wildlife rescuer and so on, but she's better at it. I'm learning Japanese. Well, apparently I'm not saying anything right because she knows. These are examples that I'm a part of, but she will tell someone she's a pro cage fighter after going to one Muay Thai class. Or someone gets sick, well, that means the drive is wrong because she's worse. None of the therapists she's seen have been able to get her to cut the BS and be a real person. She also won't take any meds she's given because she doesn't need them apparently. Sorry for the rant. Not a therapist, but in my first experience I realized we were a good match when she told me that I was generally well adjusted once I had a few good things happen in my life. I have no problem being open, but for all the topics we got to, there's things I couldn't find an in for, and sitting down and blurting out about a worry about an eating disorder was too high a wall to scale, and she seemed to take all her cues from me. I was expecting it to be a push-pull, where she could challenge my thoughts, process, notions, but instead she just kind of agreed with me. I got a much-needed ADHD diagnosis out of it, but I could never get any actionable, helping items out of her to help me manage it. Most of her feedback boiled down to, "Just do it," which lol, that's the problem. I am still very depressed, very listless, hard to find anything to grab onto, and I was going to quit her, but she quit the entire practice to take a break right before I could. Still haven't found anyone else because the process is so exhausting. I know they can't help me for me, but I just need a partner to help me unravel the mess and make sense of it, what I'm doing that keeps knotting things up, and how to introduce better things in the future. How to be nicer to myself. I need the hows, real honest things to work on. Is that too much to ask?